A wolf cub was abandoned in the frozen forest. But what happened next will make you question everything you know about instinct and love. Domestic dogs raised him as one of their own, and when danger arrived, he did something no one expected. Subscribe now, like the video, and get ready for a story that will touch your heart in unexpected ways. The wind cut like invisible blades through the snow-covered pines when Michael Smith first heard the sound that would change his life forever. It wasn't exactly a howl, nor entirely a cry, but something between the two worlds that inhabited his isolated property in the Colorado Rockies Mountains. The storm had arrived with fury that December night, and between the creaking of the trees and the drumming of freezing rain against the cabin windows, that fragile, desperate lament echoed like a plea that nature itself seemed to ignore. Michael got up from the table where he was reviewing his notes on canine behavior, his eyes tired after hours spent poring over charts and meticulous observations. At 35, he had traded a promising academic career in New York for that mountain refuge, carrying with him not only research equipment, but also the weight of a broken heart and academic dreams destroyed by university politics. His only companions in that voluntary exile were 3 rescue dogs who had become his new family. Luna, a 7-year-old golden Labrador with eyes that seemed to understand human secrets. Thor, an imposing but gentle German shepherd who had been abandoned by his previous owner. And Daisy, a smart and playful mixed-breed dog that Michael had found starving on the road months before. The sound came again, weaker this time, as if life itself were escaping with each note of that song of despair. Michael grabbed his flashlight and rain gear, ignoring the warnings echoing in his scientific mind about the dangers of going out during such a storm. Thor immediately positioned himself by his side, his fur bristling in alert, while Luna and Daisy watched anxiously from the door. Something in that sound had awakened a primitive instinct in all of them, an urgency that transcended reason. The rain lashed his face as Michael followed the sound through the darkness, Thor guiding with his superior night vision. The flashlight beam danced among the trees, creating ghostly shadows that seemed to come alive. It was then that he saw it, a small gray shape, no larger than a house cat, trembling violently against the base of a fallen pine. The cub's yellow eyes reflected the flashlight's light, and in that moment Michael knew exactly what he had found. A gray wolf cub, no more than a few weeks old, abandoned or orphaned after the passage of illegal hunters who had been spotted in the area days before. Scientific protocol clearly dictated what to do. Do not interfere. Contact environmental authorities. Let nature take its course. But when the small creature tried to crawl towards him, its weak legs barely managing to support its wet, malnourished body, something inside Michael broke. Perhaps it was the memory of all the times he himself had felt abandoned, or perhaps it was simply impossible to ignore such a desperate plea for help. Removing his coat, he gently wrapped the cub, feeling the fragile bones through the soaked fur. The return to the cabin was a silent procession under the storm. Thor stayed close, as if understanding the gravity of the situation, while the cub remained motionless in Michael's arms, only its eyes moving to observe this strange, warm new world. Upon crossing the threshold, Luna and Daisy approached cautiously, noses working frantically to process the wild and unknown scent Michael carried with him. It was Luna who took the initiative that would change everything. The Labrador, who had lost her own litter months earlier in a complicated birth, slowly approached the small wolf. Michael watched, fascinated and apprehensive, as she sniffed the cub with maternal care. Then, in a gesture that defied thousands of years of evolution and domestication, Luna began to lick the small body, cleaning it with the same dedication she would have shown her own puppies. The wolf, too weak to resist or even understand what was happening, simply closed his eyes, and for the first time in days, perhaps weeks, relaxed completely. The first 24 hours were critical. Michael improvised a heated bed near the fireplace, where Luna settled protectively beside the cub. Thor stood guard at the entrance, while Daisy, curious as always, watched every movement with almost scientific interest. Michael prepared a special formula of puppy milk, hoping that the small wolf would accept the food. It took hours of patient attempts, with Luna encouraging the cub with small nudges of her nose, until finally he began to nurse from the makeshift bottle. During that long first night, while the storm roared outside, Michael confronted the moral and scientific dilemma of his decision. As a researcher, he knew he was crossing a dangerous line. Wolves were not domestic animals, and raising one in captivity without authorization was not only illegal, but potentially dangerous. But as he watched Luna care for the cub with such devotion, and saw how Thor and Daisy had accepted the new member without hesitation, something told him he was witnessing an extraordinary phenomenon that deserved to be documented. In the following weeks, the cub, whom Michael secretly started calling Ash, although he tried to maintain emotional distance by not officially naming him, began to show signs of recovery. His eyes, previously dull with hunger and cold, gained the characteristic sparkle of healthy predators. But the most fascinating thing was observing how he interacted with his canine saviors. Instead of the typically lupine behaviors Michael expected to document, Ash began to mimic his adopted siblings in surprising ways. The first sign came when Michael distributed treats to the dogs after their morning training. Thor, Luna, and Daisy sat obediently, tails wagging in anticipation. Ash, observing from the corner where he usually stayed, hesitated for a moment before awkwardly attempting to copy the posture. His hind legs didn't fully cooperate, and he ended up falling sideways, but the attempt was clear. Michael almost dropped the treat jar, so great was his surprise. In all his years studying canine behavior, he had never witnessed anything like it. Ash's transformation did not go unnoticed, only within the cabin. During one of his rare trips to the nearest village to buy supplies, Michael overheard conversations about strange wolf sightings in the area. The illegal hunters had made the area nervous, and there were rumors that an entire pack had been decimated. Weeks earlier, Michael's heart sank at the thought that Ash might be the sole survivor of his family, but he also knew he needed to be even more careful to protect his secret. It was during this period that Helen Johnson entered his life like CUB, a summer storm, sudden, intense, and transformative. A veterinarian specializing in wildlife, she had been temporarily hired by the city hall to assess the impact of illegal hunting on the native animal population. Michael first met her in the small village general store, her arms full of medical supplies as she passionately debated with the owner about the importance of environmental conservation. Helen had the kind of presence that filled any room. Dark hair always pulled back in a practical bun, brown eyes that seemed to see through people, and an energy that suggested she could both save a life and start a revolution before breakfast. When their eyes met for the first time over the canned goods shelves, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced since leaving New York. An instant connection that both scared and intrigued him. The conversation started about the weather. The winter was being particularly harsh, but quickly evolved into their shared interests in animal behavior. Helen mentioned looking for a suitable location to establish a temporary observation base, and Michael, in an impulsive decision that surprised him, offered to show her some trails near his property. What he didn't tell her was about the little four-legged secret that was now part of his unconventional family. Helen's visits to the nearby trails became more frequent, and with them came conversations that lasted for hours. She shared stories of her years working in nature reserves across the United States, her eyes shining when she spoke about animals she had helped rehabilitate. Michael in turn found himself opening up about his disillusionment with the academic world, something he hadn't shared with anyone since moving to the mountains. It was during Helen's fourth visit that Michael's secret was almost revealed. They had stopped for lunch in a clearing overlooking the valley when Daisy came running down the trail, clearly on a mission to find her owner. The problem was that Daisy wasn't alone. Ash followed awkwardly, still learning to navigate the uneven terrain with his disproportionately fast-growing legs. The moment Helen saw Ash was electric. Her trained eyes immediately recognized that this was no ordinary puppy, and Michael saw in them a mix of surprise, fascination, and something that might have been disappointment. The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity, broken only by the sound of Daisy panting happily, completely oblivious to the tension of the moment. How long? was all Helen asked, her voice carefully neutral. Michael told her everything: the night of the storm, the deplorable state in which he found Ash, the extraordinary adoption by Luna, and his observations about the cub's unique development. As he spoke, he watched Helen's expressions change from professional detachment to genuine scientific curiosity, and finally to something that resembled reluctant admiration. "You know, this is completely irregular," she said finally, but there was a hint of a smile on her lips. "But it's also fascinating. The behavior you're describing, the social adaptation. This could rewrite much of what we know about behavioral plasticity in wild canids." From that day on, Helen became a confidant and collaborator in what she insisted on calling the most ethically questionable and scientifically revolutionary experiment she had ever witnessed. Her visits now included detailed observation sessions, where she documented every interaction between Ash and the domestic dogs with professional rigor. Summer arrived with its own complications. Ash had grown considerably, and his lupine characteristics were becoming increasingly evident. His gray coat had developed the distinct markings of his species, and his size already surpassed Daisy's. But the most remarkable thing was how he had developed a unique set of behaviors that blended wild instinct with domestic learning. During the mornings, it was possible to observe him participating in the domestic dog's routine, patiently waiting his turn to eat, responding to basics, commands Michael used with the others, and even retrieving objects when asked. But as evening fell, his wild instincts emerged. He would patrol the perimeter of the property with an intensity no domestic dog would show, his keen senses detecting changes in the environment that the others ignored. It was during one of these evening patrols that Ash proved his worth dramatically. Michael was working on his notes on the porch when Ash began to display a behavior he had never seen before. A mix of low growl and tense posture, focused in a specific direction in the forest. Thor and Luna, sensing the young wolf's agitation, also went on alert. Minutes later, the reason became clear. 3 men emerged from the tree line carrying rifles and traps, illegal hunters who had returned to the area. Michael felt his blood run cold. If they discovered Ash, the consequences would be disastrous not only for the wolf, but for all his work. But Ash, demonstrating an intelligence that surprised even Michael, did not attack or flee. Instead, he positioned himself strategically between the domestic dogs and the intruders, his body tense but controlled. As the men approached the property, it was Thor who barked the warning, but it was Ash's silent, menacing presence that seemed to unnerve them most. "What the hell kind of dog is that?" Michael heard one of them mutter, pointing at Ash. "Looks like a German Shepherd mix," another replied, clearly uncomfortable. "But too big. Let's go. There's something strange here." As the hunters retreated, Michael realized he was trembling, not from fear, but from admiration. Ash had assessed the situation and responded not as a wild wolf who might have attacked or run, but as an intelligent guardian, using presence and strategy instead of violence. Helen arrived hours later, alerted by an urgent message from Michael. When she heard about the incident, her eyes sparkled with a mixture of concern and scientific excitement. "He's developing what we might call hybrid social intelligence," she theorized, jotting down quick notes. "Combining the instinctive caution of the wolf with the learned loyalty of the domestic dog." The proximity of danger brought a new urgency to their work. Helen suggested formalizing the study, seeking official permits before someone discovered it and created legal problems. But that would mean exposing Ash to official scrutiny, possibly separation from his adopted family. It was a risk neither of them was willing to take yet. The following weeks brought a routine of heightened vigilance. Michael installed security cameras around the property, officially for his canine behavior study, but in reality, to detect any unwanted approach. Ash, as if understanding the need for discretion, became more careful in his external appearances, staying close to the other dogs and mimicking their behaviors when there was a risk of being seen. It was during this tense period that the relationship between Michael and Helen deepened in ways neither had anticipated. The long hours spent Together, observing and documenting created an intimacy that went beyond the professional. Helen began bringing dinner when her observation sessions extended late into the night, and Michael found himself anticipating these shared meals with an eagerness he hadn't felt in years. One particularly memorable night, while watching Ash play with Daisy under the moonlight, the wolf had learned to moderate his strength so as not to hurt the smaller dog. Helen shared the story that had led her to wildlife veterinary medicine. Her younger brother had died in an accident when she was only 16, and she had channeled her grief into protecting lives that couldn't protect themselves. The vulnerability in her voice as she told the story touched Michael deeply, and he found himself sharing his own wounds. The academic betrayal that had exiled him to the mountains, the painful end of his engagement when he chose research over a conventional life. Into sight, the starry mountain sky with the distant sound of Ash and the dogs playing, they discovered in each other not just scientific colleagues, but souls who understood the price of dedication to something greater than themselves. When Helen finally left that night, she left behind her scarf forgotten on the porch, a gesture Michael suspected hadn't been entirely accidental. The fire started on a dry August afternoon, when winter was slow to arrive and the vegetation was dangerously parched. Michael first noticed the distant smoke while feeding the animals, a dark column rising beyond the line of pines to the north. Forest fires were not uncommon in the region, but the wind direction suggested this one might be different. The following hours were filled with tense preparation. Michael packed his most important research data, prepared emergency backpacks, and kept the radios on for updates. Helen arrived at dusk, her face etched with worry. Authorities had begun evacuations in areas closer to the fire, but Michael's property was still outside the immediate danger zone. "We need to have a plan for Ash," she said, getting straight to the point. "If we have to evacuate, we can't just take him to a regular shelter." It was the dilemma they both feared facing. Ash had grown even larger, and now, at 8 months old, it was impossible to disguise him as a domestic dog to even minimally trained eyes. His lupine characteristics were unmistakable. The long legs, the narrow chest, the angular head, and especially those piercing yellow eyes that carried a wild intelligence no domestic dog possessed. The decision to stay was made jointly, although Helen had initially protested. They would monitor the situation closely and leave only if absolutely necessary. What neither of them anticipated was the speed with which the wind would change during the night. Michael woke to the sound of Ash howling, not the playful howl he occasionally let out to communicate with the dogs, but a primordial sound of alarm that made every hair on his body stand on end. The air was thick with smoke, and the orange glow on the horizon had drawn dangerously close during the night. Panic could have taken over, but it was then that Ash demonstrated the true gift of his unique upbringing. While Michael and Helen struggled to organize the emergency evacuation, the young wolf surprisingly took the lead. He gathered Thor, Luna, and Daisy with military efficiency, using a combination of postures and vocalizations Michael had never documented before. When they finally left, the property was already being licked by the first tongues of fire. The main road was blocked by fallen trees, and the heat was suffocating. It was then that Ash did something extraordinary. He began to guide the group along a path none of them knew, moving with purpose through the difficult terrain. "He's taking us to the river," Helen realized, her voice mixing admiration and relief. "But how does he know a path we don't?" The answer came in the form of ancient paw prints and territorial markings that only trained lupine eyes would recognize. Ash was following ancestral routes of his species, paths that wolves had used for generations to cross those mountains, but doing so while maintaining a pace appropriate for his domestic and human companions. The journey was a nightmare of smoke and heat. When Thor got trapped under a fallen branch, it was Ash who first noticed his absence and went back to alert Michael. The wolf used the same technique Daisy used to get attention, running between Michael and the problem spot, but with an urgency that was purely lupine. Together they freed Thor, the German shepherd limping but able to continue. Hours later, exhausted and covered in ash, they finally reached the safety of a village out of the fire's path. The relief was palpable, but brief. As soon as they entered the small central square, curious glances and whispers began. A group of soot-covered dogs and humans wasn't uncommon during a fire evacuation, but Ash was impossible to ignore. Dr. Robert Williams, the local veterinarian and wildlife specialist, approached the group with measured steps. His eyes fixed on Ash with the professional recognition of decades of experience. Michael felt Helen squeeze his hand, both knowing that the moment they feared had arrived. "That's a gray wolf," Dr. Williams said simply, no accusation in his voice, just a statement. "A juvenile by the size, about 8, maybe 9 months." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of fire truck sirens. Michael straightened his shoulders, ready to defend Ash and the extraordinary circumstances of his upbringing. But it was Helen who spoke first. "Dr. Williams," she began, her voice professional, masking emotion. "I'm Dr. Helen Johnson, a specialist in wildlife behavior. What you're seeing here is possibly the most extraordinary case of behavioral adaptation in canids ever documented." She proceeded to explain, in precise but passionate scientific terms, Ash's story and the observations they had made. Dr. Williams listened attentively, his eyes alternating between Helen and the young wolf who remained calmly among his canine companions, displaying none of the aggressive or fearful behaviors typical of a wild wolf in an urban environment. "Do you have documentation?" he asked finally. "Observational data, behavioral records?" Michael nodded, pointing to the backpack he carried. "Months of detailed observations, videos, comparative behavioral analyses. I was planning to submit it for publication, but first you needed to ensure the animal's well-being," Dr. Williams finished, a small smile appearing on his face. "I understand. And having seen how he behaved during this crisis, how he guided you to safety, that's not typical wolf behavior, nor dog. It's something new." The following weeks were a whirlwind of negotiations, paperwork, and planning. Dr. Williams, impressed by what he had witnessed, became an unexpected ally. He had connections with a national conservation program that was looking for exactly this type of unique case for study. The proposal that arrived exceeded Michael and Helen's best hopes. Instead of separating Ash from his adopted family, the program offered to fund the construction of a specialized research facility on Michael's property, which had miraculously survived the fire with minimal damage. Ash could remain with his companions while contributing to the advancement of scientific knowledge about animal behavior and adaptation. The construction of the new facility brought its own series of challenges and discoveries. The enclosure needed to be large enough to satisfy the needs of a growing wolf, but also allow for continuous interaction with the domestic dogs that were his family. Helen, now officially a co-investigator on the project, spent increasing amounts of time on the property, overseeing the details and continuing her observations. It was during the installation of one of the observation cameras that another significant moment occurred between her and Michael. Working side by side on the roof of the new observation structure, Helen briefly lost her balance. Michael instinctively caught her, and for a moment they were too close, the setting sun painting the mountains, gold behind them. The kiss that followed was as inevitable as the changing seasons, sealing a partnership that had transcended the professional long ago. Ash, observing from the ground with what Michael swore was an air of approval, let out a soft howl that was immediately answered by enthusiastic barks from Thor, Luna, and Daisy. It was as if the entire makeshift pack was celebrating the union of their human leaders. Autumn brought the project's first public test. A symposium on animal behavior was organized at the State University, and Michael and Helen were invited to present their preliminary findings. The decision to bring Ash was risky but necessary. Data and videos were one thing, but witnessing the phenomenon personally was something else entirely. The presentation was carefully structured. First, the data. Graphs showing Ash's unique responses to both wild and domestic stimuli. Videos of his interactions with the dogs. Analyses of his hybrid vocalizations. The audience of academics and professionals listened with polite but evident skepticism. Then came the moment for the live demonstration. In the specially prepared auditorium, Ash calmly entered alongside Thor, Luna, and Daisy. What followed left the audience in absolute silence. Through a series of carefully planned exercises, Ash demonstrated his unique ability to switch between lupine and canine behaviors as the situation required. When Helen spread different scents around the arena, some of wild prey, others of potential threats, Ash responded with instinctive wolf precision. But when Michael gave commands he had taught the dogs, the wolf obeyed with the same readiness and enthusiasm as his domestic companions. The most impactful moment came when a volunteer child, a professor's daughter carefully instructed, entered the arena. Ash, who should have shown a wild wolf's natural caution towards strangers, instead demonstrated the same gentle curiosity that Luna exhibited, approaching only when the child showed comfort. The silence that followed the demonstration was broken by thunderous applause. Questions poured in from all sides, about methodology, about implications for understanding domestication, about the potential for conservation programs. Michael and Helen answered with the necessary scientific rigor, but also with the passion of those who had witnessed something truly extraordinary. Winter arrived again, marking a full year since that fateful night Michael had found Ash. The property was transformed. In addition to the original cabin, there was now the research complex with observation areas, monitoring equipment, and suitable spaces for all the animals. But most importantly, it had become a home in the fullest sense of the word. Helen had officially moved in, bringing not only her belongings but also 2 rescue cats that, to everyone's surprise, Ash accepted with the same ease as he interacted with the dogs. Mornings now began with shared coffee on the porch, watching Ash lead the pack on their morning patrols, a wolf who had learned to be a guardian without losing his wild essence. The project had attracted international attention, collaboration, proposals arrived regularly, and graduate students requested internship opportunities. But Michael and Helen were careful to keep the well-being of Ash and his family as a priority. Each new element was introduced gradually, always respecting the bonds that had made the entire project possible. One particularly cold afternoon, as the snow began to fall softly, Michael found himself back at his desk, but this time he wasn't alone. Helen worked beside him on her own analyses. The fire crackled in the fireplace, and at their feet, a scene that still filled him with wonder. Ash slept peacefully, using Thor as a pillow, while Luna rested protectively by his side and Daisy snored softly leaning against his back. It was an impossible image, a wild wolf in perfect harmony with domestic dogs, 2 worlds that nature had separated thousands of years ago brought together again by extraordinary circumstances and, more importantly, by love. The love of a maternal Labrador who saw beyond species differences, the love of a man who chose compassion over protocol, and the love of a woman who risked her career to protect something unique and precious. The article Michael was finalizing wasn't just about animal behavior or adaptive plasticity. It was about the bridges we can build when we choose to see beyond the rigid categories we create. Ash was no longer entirely wolf nor entirely dog. He had become something new, living proof that the boundaries we believe insurmountable are often limitations we impose on ourselves. As the snow continued to fall, covering the mountains, with its silent mantle, Michael took Helen's hand and squeezed gently. She smiled without looking up from her work, but intertwined her fingers with his. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the echoes of ancient howls and the promise of future discoveries. Ash stirred in his sleep, a small sound escaping his throat, half lupine growl, half canine sigh. It was the sound of a being who had found his place in the world, not despite his dual nature, but because of it. And in that cabin in the mountains, surrounded by love and acceptance, they had all found something rare and precious, a home where being different was not just accepted, but celebrated. The last paragraph of Michael's article captured the essence of his journey. What began as an impulsive act of compassion on a stormy night became a window into understanding not only the remarkable adaptability of life, but also our own capacity to transcend the barriers we create. Ash taught us that wildness and domesticity are not irreconcilable opposites, but different faces of the same coin, the fundamental need for connection, family, and belonging that unites all living creatures. The snow had stopped falling when Michael finally closed his laptop. Helen had fallen asleep in her chair, her glasses still balanced precariously on her nose. Gently, he removed them and covered her with a blanket. Ash opened a yellow eye, observed the scene, and went back to sleep, secure in the knowledge that his pack, all of them, human and canine, was safe and together. Outside, the stars shone over the snow-covered mountains, silent witnesses to a story that defied expectations and redefined possibilities. And somewhere in the distant forest, a solitary howl echoed, not a lament of loneliness, but a song of recognition from a wild cousin to the one who had found a different path. Michael smiled at the sound. A year ago, he had been a broken man seeking refuge in solitude. Now he was part of something greater, an improbable family, an unexpected love, and a discovery that would change the way the world understood the nature of connection between species. As he prepared for bed, a final reflection crossed his mind, and he whispered to the silent night, "And you, when will you let hope bloom in your desert?" The answer came in the form of a collective sigh from his sleeping companions. Man, woman, wolf, and dogs all dreaming under the same roof, living proof that the most extraordinary miracles are often born from the simplest gestures of kindness and acceptance.